Okay.
Start again when you're ready.
Okay. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Tony Whitfield. I'm the Associate Dean for Civic Engagement at Parsons. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight for the first of this semester's presentation, sponsored by a committee that's come together to really address a body of work that's being done across divisions at the new school. Parsons, Lang, and Milano primarily are represented on that committee, but we believe we can actually throw a lasso over everybody else and bring them in also over time. Largely, the committee was formed to create a context in which faculty could talk about and develop resources to support activities that you are all involved in your coursework and elsewhere to address social issues through various means and various disciplines that you're all involved in here. Tonight's panel is the outgrowth of a discussion that we had about what this year's presentations would focus on. And it was clear that one of the things that we really wanted to do was to focus on people who were involved in creative disciplines and the way in which creative disciplines actually also address social issues. After a good deal of discussion, we kind of landed on film. And I think it was driven by the fact that so much of filmmaking is really dependent on storytelling and the success of the filmmaker's work in telling that story. In order to understand the work that we are doing around social issues, the story is paramount. And we came to a decision to focus on documentary filmmaking and how, in fact, documentary filmmaking addressed social issues and could actually act as a kind of catalyst for activity, for thought, for change. We have three filmmakers tonight who are involved in a variety of different kinds of filmmaking and a variety of different activities. One of the things that we realized when in choosing this group was that filmmaking wasn't necessarily the first thing that they thought they were going to be doing with their lives. That they came to filmmaking driven to tell a story. And I think for all of us, there is a lot to learn in the way a story gets structured and the way you tell the story and your ability to actually have your audience understand the perspective, the issues, the problems that you really are trying to bring to light. So I'm going to move now. What I'm going to do now is introduce our panelists and ask them each to come up and tell you a bit about how they came to filmmaking and show you a clip of one film, a short clip. We don't want to show too much because we want you to actually go out and find the film and go see it. The films are also from a variety of different points in the last decade, which I think also will, in retrospect, may be an interesting discussion about how these times have actually changed and how they actually affect the ability to tell a story and what people are actually expecting about, hoping to see represented in film these days. in alphabetical order. Let's do it that way. Our first filmmaker is David France, who is fresh from a crazy week at Sundance, where his first film, How to Survive a Plague, got enormous amounts of very positive attention. David's an award-winning journalist and New York Times best-selling author for his book, what is that book? Our Fathers, I'm sorry. Our Fathers is actually the third of David's books. The first was Bag of Toys. The second was Our Fathers, and the third was a collaboration with New Jersey's governor, Jim McGreevey, called The Confession. Clearly he takes on difficult issues, but stories that everyone wants to hear somehow. Our Fathers focused on the scandals in the Catholic Church. Today, he's one of the best-known chroniclers of the AIDS epidemic based upon years and years of work in that area. He's continued to write for the New York Times since the beginning of the epidemic. How to Survive a Plague tells that story. He was an editor at Newsweek for investigations until 2003, and now he writes for GQ and for New York Magazine and for other publications about social issues ranging from hydrofracking to AIDS-related issues, and how, in fact, there was an article recently, or a couple of years ago, that he wrote on the effect of AIDS meds on the body of patients, AIDS patients. Mr. France has received the National Headliner Award and the GLAAD Media Award, and has seen his work inspire several films, most recently a Showtime film for Our Fathers. He's also at work on a book that will be a companion piece to How to Survive a Plague. Next will be Linda Goode Bryant. Linda's an award-winning documentary filmmaker and media artist who's produced, directed, and edited feature-length and short documentaries for television, the internet, and public installation. In 2004, she became interested in creating narrative forms and structures that alter the use of public space, the routines of daily life, and the ways in which we act and react to common assumptions and social norms. She started an organization at that time called the Active Citizens Project to develop her ideas for narratives in collaboration with young people, for the most part. To develop her ideas about narrative structures and for creating art that's a form of action. Her current work is Project EATS, and it's also situated in the Active Citizens Project. It applies arts concepts, strategies, and tools as opposed to those generated by public policy to reshape and create social, economic, and political conditions that increase the viability of working class communities and the well-being of their residents. Prior to filmmaking, Ms. Bryant was the founding director of Just Above Midtown, a not-for-profit organization for artists of color and primarily African-American artists here in New York City. Ms. Bryant is a Guggenheim Fellow and a Peabody Award recipient. She has a master's degree in business from Columbia and a bachelor's of art degree in painting from Spelman. And the third is Robin Hayes, who is a faculty member at Milano and was the first person at Yale to earn a combined doctorate in African American Studies and Political Science. After completing her bachelor's degree at NYU with honors, she supervised the legal clinic for homeless families and at the Urban Justice Center, and facilitated human rights delegations and aid shipments to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Chiapas in Mexico as a national coordinator for the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. In addition to publishing scholarly articles in Selves, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, and Maroon, the Yale Journal of American Studies, of African American Studies. Ms. Hayes has given lectures about her work on the politics of the African diaspora at the University of California in Berkeley, the University of Chicago, University of Southern California, Indiana University, the University of Washington in Seattle, and at Middlebury College. Currently, she's finishing a manuscript entitled African Liberation, Black Power, and the Diasporic Underground. Ms. Hayes has held residential fellowships at Williams College, Northwestern University, and received support for her research from the Ford Foundation. She comes to her position at the New School from Santa Clara University, where she was assistant professor of ethnic studies and political science. With funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, she was the scholar in residence. She was a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Now, what we're going to do is actually let each of the filmmakers tell you a bit about their work and show you a clip. And what we're going to begin with Linda Bryant, who is here in the audience.
Thank you. Does this go down?
Yeah.
There we go. I actually talk so loudly. Probably don't need it. Anyway, I'm trying to find the time here. Okay, so we can stay to 15 minutes. Good evening. I came to New York to pursue my work as an artist. And at the time, I was a painter. And on the airplane, as we were flying over New York and about to land, I was sitting in a window seat, and I saw this amazing skyline of New York City. And it was, I'm from Ohio and went to school in Georgia. And so it was, I was awed by it. And in that moment decided, I really am not that good an artist. Like, I could not make what I'm seeing outside this plane's window. And instantly decided I'd be a curator. And so I had come to New York to go to grad school. I switched my major to art history and focused on contemporary Western art as my specialty. In the process of working on a master's degree in art history, I got an opportunity to be a fellow at the Metropolitan Museum. And it was not the best experience I ever had. And it was during a time when the work of African American artists and other artists was just not being shown. It wasn't being shown in galleries, it wasn't being shown in museums. For the most part, it was being shown in community spaces, in Black and brown communities. After, it was really interesting, at the time the director of the Metropolitan was a man named Tom Hoving, and we would get into these debates every day. Like, as a fellow, he decided that he wanted me to come up to his office, and we would get into these horrible debates, actually quite fascinating debates, about the museum and its policies and why it showed who it showed. And I would always end the debate by saying, I'm going to burn this motherfucker down. That somehow led me to the Studio Museum. I said, I'm going to burn this motherfucker down. And I went to the Studio Museum. And it was at a time when the Studio Museum was run by a gentleman, Ed Spriggs, that was very nationalistic in his political leanings, but also in his vision about art. And so the work that the studio showed was figurative for the most part, and had a lot of red, green, and black in it, and mother's nursing. And visually that wasn't what turned me on. I liked more, I liked non-figurative work and conceptual pieces and performance. And so anyway, I got into a big battle with that director and decided, you know what, it's time to start a space. And so I started just above Midtown. And it was at just above Midtown which was located on 57th Street between 5th and 6th. And for any of you who did not live in that period, you will not know, you can't, hopefully I can convey to you the fact that a 22, 23, I think year old single mom would start a gallery on 57th Street between 5th and 6th, which was a major gallery district with absolutely no money. I was able to con Citibank into a $2,000 loan, which I defaulted on. But anyway, to start this space was pretty absurd, and I was very naive. 15 years later, though, what had happened was that there were a number of artists that are international art stars now in the visual arts and performance and music and dance that actually got opportunities to present their work to the larger society through just above Midtown. And at that time, I have to say that Jam was more than an exhibition space. It was a revolution for me. It was like, up to that point, while I was at the Met and while I was at the Studio Museum and before I even came to New York, the lament among artists, African-American artists, was so much about, the lament could be summarized as, they won't let us. They won't let me, they won't let us, they won't let me. And in my mind, it was like, fuck them. Let's just do it for ourselves. So Jam was that statement of saying, let's just do it for ourselves and go from there. Anyway, while I was doing Jam, which is how I got a business degree, there was a guy, Barnabas McHenry, who was involved with donors to the Met. I met him through his wife, who was involved with the Metropolitan. Anyway, the short of this story is, his wife was saying, you should give her money for her space. And so he came to meet with me at Jam on 57th Street and proceeded to really be very rude. And he kept saying, you don't know anything about business, you don't know anything about this, you don't know anything about that. And so I just kind of said, okay, so I'll get a business degree. And so he said, you can't do that. You can't possibly do that. You have babies, you have this, you have that. So that led me there. Now, why am I telling you that? Primarily because this is the route that my life took that ultimately has led me to be here tonight and what I'm doing today. And that's an important component of that. After Jam, I found heaven. I found documentary filmmaking. And I didn't know to find it. I just happened, actually I happened by the New School one day. I was just walking in this neighborhood. I happened by, something told me in my head to go into this building on 12th Street, I think. Anyway, go inside to the lobby. I don't know why. I go inside the lobby and there are catalogs stacked everywhere. I pick up a catalog, I open it up, and the page I open it to is Filmmaking 1 and 2. And I go, oh, shoot, I could do that. And maybe a week later, I'm walking by J&R downtown, and I said, you should use this money that you should pay your taxes with and buy a camera. And I bought a camera. And the next thing I knew, I was making movies. And I had truly, truly discovered heaven. You will see a clip from the last feature I made called Flag Wars. During the making of Flag Wars, which is a cinema verite piece, and we shot it over the course of 4 years. We had over 300 hours worth of footage we had to cut down from. We lived, this was co-produced with the filmmaker Laura Poitras. She and I did it together. We lived in the community for 2 years. And during the making of that, which was enormously rewarding, it started to nag at me. This notion about, could a documentary film live off screen? Could it in fact exist in a way that changed the conditions of the place where it was being told? And not in a dark room with people being moved or not moved, and then for 2 hours feeling good or not good about what they saw, and perhaps being inspired to sign a petition or to go online and find out more about it. was it possible to create art that in fact had a more direct impact on changing the conditions where that art existed? So from that point on, since 2004, I've really been pursuing this notion of art as action, art action. And Project EATS, which Tony mentioned, is an art action in art and agriculture, which works with Black and brown communities, working class communities in New York City, to create community-owned and operated urban farms and food distribution and food enterprises. Project EATS is set up wherein we are not successful if we're not obsolete in 4 years. That the whole point of this is to work with communities to enhance the skills that are there and to develop more skills that make it possible for food production to be a viable means of food for the community and a resource that the community can then invest in its own well-being. So with that, I'll play a clip from Flag Wars.
Nina speaking, may I help you? Okay. It's a cute house, there are tenants in there, so we have to give notice before we show, but, no, it's a more Linden area. No, actually, I had 2 other ones up there, but they also won the contract last week. I think that's pretty much it for that kind of money. Rodney, do you have a different watch than me, or what? I'm just kidding. It's Nina. You must be on gay time or something.
And old part of town is getting a new look, but not everyone is happy about it. In fact, people are buying up homes in Old Town East, just east of downtown. They are fixing them up and selling them for big dollars. And in some cases, big problems. As 10 to the Eyewitness News reporter Kelly Hudson shows us, some die-hard residents are wondering if they will survive this rehab movement.
Displacement of elderly and low-income residents is a real fear factor here. Natalie says she's seen it happen before.
I'm not complaining about bringing the living condition up. I'm concerned about the welfare of other people and how can they, in turn, get financed to keep their homes up. Now,
Good question.
this is what I'm concerned about.
Good question.
I've tried.
It's ready, don't it?
And I'd love to grab that thing. It's such a beautiful building.
That's cute.
But they're,
Double or what?
yeah, they won't talk to anyone.
Who is in there?
That's some family's been there forever.
Oh, yeah.
You can tell by the curtains, they've been up forever too.
Yeah, the park on the front porch.
It's a sweet house. And people wait in line for that one. It's gonna get hot. I knew it. I'm gonna sweat. I hate to sweat. These are halfway houses on the other end. Still haven't given up their hold to the neighborhood. The last of the few. This, that, and that. You know, it takes care of that block, and let's move down the next block. I think idiot that owns the one on 21st and Bride, that big beautiful thing. But well, I'm not selling. But oh well, he too shall pass, and the yellow XL. So.
Thank you. So as you have probably figured out, this is a film about gentrification that took place in a black community in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. And one of the things that really affected me as we were doing this film was the way that public policy and public thought views urban communities. And it views them from what I'd say through a deficit lens as opposed to through an asset lens. Where in fact, if you were to look at, just in New York City, if you look at the neighborhoods where you could actually build or grow from, it's not the Upper West Side, it's not the Upper East Side, it's not Soho. Those buildings, I mean, those communities have been fully exploited of most, if not all, the resources available. In fact, it's the communities that are working class communities. So Project EATS is about how to ensure that the people who have been long-term residents in these communities are able to stay in those communities, make them viable, and generate the resources they need for their own well-being. Thank you.
Next is David France.
So this water up here a problem? Hi, everybody. I am not as eloquent as Linda, so I'll be brief. I am a longtime journalist, as Tony said, and I actually started in journalism in order to cover the AIDS epidemic when it first washed into New York and the rest of the world in 1981. And it was what I felt I could do to help. AIDS spawned so many things. Some of you may remember when it came to New York, it spawned social service organizations, and people became full-time caregivers when they hadn't arranged their lives around that to begin with. People became activists. Activism took foot within the first few years of HIV's arrival in New York. And what I felt I could do was tell the stories. And I started in alternative publications and gay presses when no one else was writing about AIDS. The New York Times would do one article a year, one in 81, one in 82, maybe 3 in 1983, as an epidemic was raging through initially the gay population downtown in New York, which was the epicenter of the global plague at that time. And then ultimately how it dispersed was also not covered by the major media. So that's what I did. I covered AIDS. for a long time, and I kept covering it even after 1996 when the drug treatments, the effective treatments came out, and once again it became hard to get anyone interested in publishing anything about AIDS. But it was one of the articles that I wrote after 96, in fact, just a couple of years ago, for GQ magazine, about AIDS prevention today, and the prevention, the public health messages, and where they lack today. Why it is we still have 65,000 new HIV infections every year in this country, and we haven't done anything with that number over the last 15 years. But in that article, I took a couple of paragraphs indulgence to my own memory to talk about how AIDS prevention methodology was first developed and promulgated in the early years of the epidemic. And the feedback I got from people for that article focused almost entirely on that historic section, and mostly from young readers of the paper who couldn't even, of the magazine, who couldn't imagine a time before social media. And what I was describing in the article was how information was passed from hand to hand within the community to educate ourselves in how to protect ourselves from HIV. And that included making booklets and dropping them off in gay bars. And I remember where I was when the first booklet on safe sex arrived. And how I devoured it all in one sitting, and that those ideas were startling to people. And I realized that a lot of the plague years have gone unrecorded. That the stories that we have kind of in the canon about the AIDS epidemic all focus on the arrival of this mysterious virus, the epidemiology that took off trying to find what the cause was, and then what we lost. And that's the narrative in And the Band Played On. That's the narrative in Larry Kramer's A Normal Heart. It's the way we've told the story of AIDS. And what we missed was what the community of people affected by the disease did to overcome it. I consider that the second half of the plague years. If the plague years are from 1981 in this country to 1996, this is from 1987 to 1996, a largely unchronicled, except in the newspapers of the time, period. So that was my goal, was to tell the story of not what the virus did to us, but what we did to the virus. And although I've never made a documentary before, I remembered back then that just as I was scribbling my articles in the alternative press, there were many people who were filming or videotaping aspects of the community's response to AIDS. And that in fact, the camcorder revolution perfectly tracks the plague. HIV was first noted in 1981, and the camcorder first came out in early 1982, democratizing that ability to kind of take a measure of your own surroundings and to reveal hidden worlds. And so that's what a lot of people were doing. I remembered seeing them there with their cameras, and I thought maybe I could tell this story by going to that footage, without realizing how big a challenge I was placing before myself. That's what I started doing about 3 years ago. And ultimately, I waded through thousands of hours of footage to try to find a narrative story, a story of people, through that second half of the plague years in New York that could tell us the story of AIDS empowerment, of AIDS agency. And that's what How to Survive a Plague is. And as Tony noted, I just came back from Sundance with it, but I finished it 3 days before Sundance, so it's exciting to be able to talk about it as a completed project, but it's still new to me. I'm going to play just a trailer that gives a sense of what the film is about, and then we'll talk about it. I think I'm doing this.
Do you think that you'll live to see a cure?
No, I don't.
Do you think that you'll live? No. No.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a lie.
I was diagnosed with age-related complex while I was working as a bond trader on Wall Street. The crash of October '87, my T4s fell right with the Dow, so I said, enough of this, this job is going to kill me, and decided to become a full-time AIDS activist. First thing I went to ACT UP was such a level of anger and immediacy, and this desire to get something done, and to get it done fast.
If they don't seek to start listening to the AIDS community, then we're going to be back.
Follow me. It is the fear of a demonstration that gets us through the door.
Hi, I'm with ACT UP, and we're doing active civil disobedience. Would you please remain calm?
Drugs or consequences, this is a warning.
We will pave the way for you with the Food and Drug Administration. But this total reluctance on your part is going to get you nowhere.
See this dark mark on my forehead? That's Kaposi sarcoma. It's going to spread. It's going to kill me. You're coming to my funeral because you're the man fucking responsible. You are my murderer in your shirt and tie.
If they would keep their mouths shut and go about their business with whatever their sexual orientation is, nobody would ever say a word. We wouldn't know anything about it.
No property damage.
Well, they don't like me, and I don't like them. A bunch of them climbed up on my house in Arlington and hoisted about a 35-foot canvas condo one day and protested me.
None of us were coming to this from a medical background. Most of us were just reading everything we could lay our hands on.
It was kind of a dorky activity for a bunch of East Village hipsters and artists to sit around reading medical journal articles. People called it Science Club, like it was chess club or something.
In the absence of adequate health care, we have learned to become our own clinicians, researchers, lobbyists, drug smugglers, pharmacists.
The priority was do your homework, go inside, sit down at the table, and get to work.
Today we are introducing an agenda for AIDS treatment research and for regulatory reform in the United States.
This is the plan we're presenting. We need our government to read this plan. We need them to work with us. If they want to change it a little, we'll talk to them.
That was the first time in history that patients had a place at the side of the table that was making the decisions. And then we realized that the science really was up against a brick wall. The death rate just kept on climbing.
Showing them the actual results of what that White House and this administration has done. They have turned people we love into ashes and bones and corpses.
When the living can no longer speak, the dead may speak for them. Let the whole earth hear us now. We beg, we pray, we demand that this epidemic end.
No matter what you did, you couldn't fix anything. Nobody could.
From 93 to 95 were the worst years. It was a really terrifying time. They were the worst years. And then we got lucky. The ACT
activists proposed a study design, industry used it, it got the drug approved in 6 months.
They were calling it the Lazarus effect. People who were deathly ill get put on this drug and all of a sudden they're working again. That was a phenomenal feeling.
The virus was going down to undetectable levels and staying there.
It worked. You know, we did something remarkable.
Spencer Cox burst into tears and said, "We're going to live."
We showed them how brotherhood and one human can treat another, and community can treat itself, and overcome.
Any sort of political mobilization that you see now around any particular disease is built partly on the model that extreme activists created.
So you can see that we've built the film in a, we're calling it a 21st century way. The idea that all that up-close footage kind of behind the curtains in activism exists is something we kind of take for granted now, and I know we're starting to see the early work on the Occupy Wall Street documentaries. We've seen the way cell phone images can bring incredible truths to the world, from Iran to Egypt and elsewhere. But so we were able to go back to the archives with this old footage and try to tell the story using those techniques from the 20th century. And we'll talk more about it afterwards. But so clearly you see that it's a film about activism and how activism works. It's really kind of a primer as much as it is kind of an historic tale. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Linda. Now I want to introduce Robin Hayes.
I feel like we're going from something that is out and a documentary classic to something that is going to be out and will be documentary classic to I need to watch those and learn. But I actually became interested in documentary film from as a graduate student, being in an elite institution and studying Black studies, and realizing that this was sort of the last, when you're getting a PhD, you're like in the millionth grade, and it's, a lot of years being on a track where you're consistently told that you're fortunate because you are able to be separate from your community and able to perpetuate and legitimize dominant institutions. And the closer I came to having, to finishing graduate school and looking towards a career in academia, I realized that that was sort of not what drove me to study Black studies. And it was actually, I had quite the opposite interest. I wanted to develop this career to make an investment in my community and to develop my community, not to legitimize policies that were devastating it, in my view. And so fortunately for me, while I was a graduate student kind of having these realizations, I was in a community of other students, junior scholars, who had similar concerns. And we got together and started this group called the Black Resistance Reading Group. And we met consistently, and out of these meetings, we decided to take this trip to Cuba and see how the things we were reading about in books were really lived on the ground. And so our reflections on that trip, we decided to make a film about the trip. our reflections about that whole process are in the short, Beautiful Me's Finding Our Revolutionary Selves in Black Cuba, which is something that I actually made with the help of students while I was at Williams College. But it was with my, what's a euphemistic term I can use? Nascent capabilities, youthful capabilities in filmmaking. Not quite the complete survey that people asked for. You know, we showed it around at some film festivals, showed it on some campuses, and people really wanted to see Cuba and wanted to understand more about this connection, this historical connection between African Americans and Afro-Cubans and racism in Cuba and racism in the United States. So I have been working on adapting the short into a feature that's called Black Reconstructions. There's some conversation about, mainly in my head, about what the subtitle should be. Sometimes it's Afro-Cubans and African Americans. Sometimes it's the struggle against racism in Cuba and the United States. But we'll see what we decide. So this work is very much in progress. And as I'm sure David and Linda will also attest to, you spend a lot of time with pieces of things before you actually get to something that altogether makes sense and is a complete story. So I'm going to show you some pieces of things, and we can talk about it. But the intention of Black Reconstructions is to really make the link between how people of African descent, both in the United States and Cuba, have not received their fair share of citizenship, of resources, but in some ways Cuba has done a better job of democratically distributing resources than we have in the United States. I'll just play this.
As a political activist in high school, I came here with the intent of being very politically. I was frustrated.
Are you mad? I mean, you know.
I'm very angry. I'm very angry and lonely.
Welcome to the governors. So the topic was 1968 to 2002, are we still radical? This one woman said that just her being one of the 1.5% of Black tenured faculty at Oberlin, she is radical.
Oh, please.
And I was like, okay, let me see what she's doing this. And she goes, just me being that 1.5%, being part of that 1.5% of the faculty who goes into a board meeting or goes into a department meeting, I am being a radical. And I was like, okay, so that means that Clarence Thomas is being a radical by going to the Supreme Court and Colin Flower being a radical and called Condoleezza Rice. I was like, that's some bullshit. And everybody in the audience was head nodding. Like, I was like, okay, these are all conservative Black folks right here.
We wanted initially to raise enough money to have all of our expenses funded for the whole group to go to Cuba and not have to pay out of our own pockets. And that began to seem like something that would be impossible.
So if we could find out the difference between the 10 and the 7-day option.
The money thing was a huge obstacle, and it was a constant reminder of the kind of antagonistic space we were in at Yale. And even people and organizations that seemed or that claimed to be in support of the idea of the Black Resistance Reading Group or the idea of free travel to Cuba or the idea of people resisting to corporate or state power or any of these kinds of ideas, few of those people were actually willing to help us get there.
As I recall, it was...
I'm just going to try to fast forward a little bit so you can see a little bit of some of the stuff we have about Cuba too. And you can see our in-progress notes.
Majority of the soldiers at the end of the war were Black from Lago. For example, Antonio Maceo is the paradigm
that escaped from their slave masters that used to live in this area. All this area was covered by ruins. And this is like a symbol, praying for their God to help them. And so in a way they have like this big casserole. It was like smoke coming out of the casserole, and then that smoke, it was like a sort of guidance for them. I mean, where to go or where not to go in order to continue.
Joshua.
See,
Alright.
this is intense because there's so few monuments in the world to the struggle, to the horror of slavery, but also the struggle against slavery. This to have this monument here, that's a symbol of this resistance, alongside or it was a part of this town, this community that was built out of the struggle of the revolution, the Cuban Revolution. To see these two things together, really united, both in kind of historical memory, but also living reality, and to see those two things together is intense. And this is very also sort of spiritual because we're here in the mountains, in this valley, and you can sort of feel the unity of nature, and it's intense, and it feels good.
The word is still something that's preserved, right? And it's a quarter about that things as well. It is, I'm sorry, I'm using this word, but it is really out. It's really intense, the situation. But little by little, I guess, also we need to change people's mind. Like, the other day I was walking with my Swiss friends on the street. I was asking for my ID, and then they say, why are you asking? I asked, why are you asking me for my ID? I can walk freely with a foreigner here in Cuba. I'm Cuban. And I said, no, but you know why you're asking. I don't know what you're asking for my ID, so I need to know. And I said, you know, come out here, Cuban. And I said, hey, well, I gave him my ID. What do you do? I'm a tour guide, and I'm also an English teacher from the Ministry of Foreign Trade. And you tell me the truth, and I said, that's no problem. Then you ID did not say what I am. They only say my name, and so and then you don't have any other choice to go to check that out. And then I said, well, and why are you together with them? Because I'm probably going to Switzerland. They are friends of mine. I've been abroad one time. I went to England, and I said, what? You have been to England? No, I can't believe that. Then I had to go back to my place, show them all the paper, and they excused me. Like, it's just because I'm black, that's the problem. And the police also, we need to educate the police as well. We need to educate certain fields within the society. I mean, I'm talking about my own experience. Probably you have some other people that will tell you like different things, but I'm telling you about my own experience, and I think it's most of the black people feel the same way. That way. We have been given the same opportunity as any other citizen here in Cuba. Some people have taken it, some others don't, but some of them haven't, I mean. But I think that it's not a matter of having opportunities or having opportunities within the society. Sometimes you find people that they say, hey, you speak English, you speak French, you're not black, you're white. And I say, no, I'm black. That's the problem. They don't want to recognize us as black. They think that we're not Italian or stuff like that. So we feel like we're a bit frustrated. That's a little small comment on what it's really. Okay, ready?
Okay, so that's a little bit of what we're working with. Thank you. And we are putting the footage that we took while we were there, again, not really understanding fully what we were getting into in making this project with, what I call sort of our community's historical memory about what we know about the relationship between African Americans and Afro-Cubans. And so in doing this work, it's interesting when you make something and you show something, you show things around, you have your own perspective and your own, usually some kind of love, concern, care that has driven you to it, but it's also always striking to me the way that people respond. And in doing this work, it's really struck me how people can so easily sort of say that something's another country, and so it sort of has nothing to do with us, right? It's sort of like it's Cuba, and whatever's happening with race in Cuba is over there, and there's nothing that Cuba has to teach us. And so we really are working with this project to show the connections and to show what the benefits of real dialogue and real exchange across national borders are, especially for historically marginalized communities. And also we're developing an interactive educational platform and an outreach and engagement program that specifically works to bring the film to community-based organizations. There are a lot of amazing organizations working in the United States and abroad against racism, and this film and other work that I make is really meant to serve them and assist them in their work rather. And so our approach is to try to bring the film to where people are in their anti-racist activism, rather than to make something that's sort of seductive and tries to bring them to us or tries to get people to think to escape their condition. It's really to deepen and clarify the reality of people's condition. So thank you very much. I feel like there's a scene in the movie from the Iran-Contra hearings, and I feel like Oliver North, not guilty.
Not guilty. I don't believe it. Thank you all for doing a quick synopsis of what brought you to these projects. You know, it's interesting in seeing them and thinking about the kind of the way in which they actually cover a decade in some ways. So Linda, you were busy working on Flag Wars at in 2002, weren't you?
Yeah, we started actually in 1999.
Okay.
Yeah.
Seems like another world, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Will each of you talk a little bit about what you thought you were doing when you started the movie, and how, and whether or not there was a story that you envisioned, and how, in fact, that evolved? Whether there was a story, a goal, a kind of body of information you wanted to share. And I'm asking this also from the perspective of the fact that you're dealing with very different kinds of material. David, you were dealing with a set body of material that was in various archives. Linda, you were there kind of in the midst of a world of activity that was evolving right in front of you. And Robin, I think that there's a theory behind what you're working with here, and that's driving a certain amount of this, but still there's the film as, as a phenomenon. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? David?
Okay, I'll start. I pretty much knew what my story was. What I didn't know was how I would be able to tell it, and through whom. I knew I wanted to tell it as a story of people and a story of struggle, almost like a medical thriller. But I didn't know whose stories would allow me to do that, and so that my limitation was what was the body of the archive. So that was my first challenge, was to dig through that footage to try to find whose personal stories would help narrate that piece of history. And I could have told it probably from any number of people. And in fact, I thought I would tell it through the persona of somebody you didn't see in this clip, who ultimately came out of the movie, just because his story was not essential and wasn't advancing the storyline much. And that was a heartbreak for me, because I knew the guy. He died in '93, and I knew him and respected him and wanted to include his story in the film. But I knew for the sake of the audience, I had to leave it out.
Linda?
There's a phrase that I've often used, which is, everything is political. And what I've come to realize is that everything is story. That life itself, or the elements of life, are the elements in art. I think we as humans have through art tried to mimic the basic elements of life, which are need, obstacle, conflict, and resolution. And I think that that process exists in abstract works as well as more narrative, in a conventional sense, work that we create. So the story that, like David, the Flag Wars, we knew the story we wanted to tell. I think we were surprised by how it unfolded because it really did unfold on camera. We were there just rolling. So we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And I think what surprised both Laura and myself was that, Laura and me, was that that the gentrifiers in this story were gay and lesbian. I mean, we thought that because we were dealing with two historically oppressed groups, that gentrification would look differently. We found out that it didn't. And so in the context of that, that's something that we learned. The goal of the story, when we went into it, was more an aesthetic, artistic goal, which was to create a documentary film that unfolded like a narrative. More so than The War Room, more so than anything that Weissman had done. How does this unfold? So that people actually are like, boom, where'd you get those actors? Which actually did happen, which was kind of surprising in the end. I have to say that the trajectory I was on at that time in this newfound heaven of film and video actually led me to realize that the story I'm more interested in is the story that evolves when we bring these things we create as art in full integration with life. Not like a Richard Serra piece, so you impose it in a space and you walk around it, but in the context of creating a space where we as people reconnect with the very thing that we're biologically wired to do, which is to create what we need with what we have. That process of need, obstacle, conflict, resolution. And we live in a time and place where we are taken further and further away from that very core biological essence that we are. And we feel we're dependent and controlled by and subject to the desires of others.
I mean, I think we thought our objective was to make something that made a trip to Cuba accessible to people, right? Many more people would like to go on the kind of trip that we went to and learn about race and racism in Cuba in the way that we did, but they simply just wouldn't have the resources or the access or the time to raise the resources. And so it was the beginning of our thinking about how we could democratize the resources that had been allocated to us in different ways. And so it's still the goal of the project and the intention of the project. I think that I have begun to think more broadly about what that means, what it means to democratize resources that are made available to you, and what it means to democratize knowledge, which is the initial intention of Black studies as a discipline. I mean, Black studies can be traced back to slaves teaching each other's languages, teaching each other how to read, and in the process strategizing about how to overturn slavery. So I think, you know, the intention stays the same, but sometimes the magnitude of what that can mean and how you can implement that in your everyday work can grow. The more that you do something, the more refined your understanding of what that intention really means can become, I think.
I'm struck by the fact that all three of you came to the process of filmmaking with a language of another practice in your heads. Can you talk a little bit about what in retrospect the language of that practice is? And all of you I also know, and well, Rob and I don't know as well as I know David and Linda, but I know that you struggle with that language, and how that language actually doesn't serve necessarily some of your political goals. So, in the process of making this film, what was that struggle like, and how did you actually how'd you manage that? David, as a journalist, as someone who has sort of learned what it means to, convey a story to a broad audience, what did you learn from it?
Well, as far as the storytelling form, I thought it was going to be an easy transition, and it turned out not to be. It turned out to be very difficult medium to work in, to tell a story in. Like Linda's piece, I wanted to do a film that didn't have a narrator's voice, but that unfolded in a kind of a verite way by going back to this old footage. And what it literally got us scraping the bottoms of people's closets for more footage in order to be able to tell the story that way. So it really was a struggle. But for me, the biggest learning curve aspect of making a film was working with music, which is something I, as an investigative reporter, have never done, as you can imagine. And that was a huge challenge, to try to understand how, I respond to music in films, how music, where it's essential and where it's playing a key role, and where it's, inadvertently stepping over into kind of editorial or manipulation. And that was tough for me, but also really exciting to learn that kind of stuff and to experiment and just see how wrong my instincts were so frequently. So I don't think any of that impacted the political message of what we were trying to tell. In fact, I think that the film has power. A documentary film has power that often you can't reach in nonfiction writing. Certainly in book writing, books get read by more people, but I think for the most part. But documentary films seem to be they're treated as though there's some sort of that they have a cultural power. They're written about frequently. They become a kind of a way you describe. They frame an historic period sometimes. I think they've got power way beyond their reach, and that's really interesting to me. So I think that although I'm writing a book on the same subject and trying to finish that up, I think that the film might be able to wield this story and maybe transmit it to the generations in a way that the book won't.
Robin, what?
It's interesting because I consider myself to be a Black Studies filmmaker, which has two challenges. The Black part is, there's so many cliches and things that you would never, ever, ever, ever want to find in your film if you're concerned about racism, which people can expect. And you can be so sensitive to those cliche representations that some editors might find you to be a bit reactionary, actually. So I think that there's that concern about having a truly humanizing and in-depth treatment of subject matter that is hard to find in the medium, I think, when it comes to people of African descent. But sometimes the most in-depth, refined treatment of subject matter is not something you want to see in a movie. And so finding that balance in the same, I think, when you're coming to filmmaking from a scholarly background, your concept of what's important and what people need to know and understand and what is a surface treatment of a subject versus an in-depth treatment is not, again, necessarily, it doesn't necessarily work in film form. And so the drawback of the medium is also the lure of the medium, because it's so accessible. It's something now that you can have a movie anywhere, anytime. And so it's a way to get ideas and communicate in such, as it was saying, in such a broad way, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the kind of in-depth nuance that you might want to have if you're talking about racism or you're talking about history. And so I think that it's always a tension and trying, I think the best documentaries find that balance somehow, and invite you to learn more at your own pace in different ways. But I think it's tricky.
Linda, coming at it from an art perspective,
right?
Or whatever your perspective.
Tony and I have known each other way too long, so and he will say, "God, what perspective are you in today?" I'd say that I'm a big fan and have been of Pina Bausch, and there's a documentary out for those of you who haven't seen it, which is really quite amazing, of her work. When I left the documentary, I was reminded of the fact that for Pina Bausch there was no box. And I think that too often I have been caught in trying to fuck the box. Like, what can I do with this box? How can I twist it? How can I reshape it? How can I bend it? How can I make it something other than a box? And it was good to be reminded that there's more freedom if you realize there is no box. So that's something that has come out of Flag Wars as well as the work I've done since then. I think the other thing which is connected to that is the ability to just be present, the ability to just be in that moment without all the devices that we use to not be in a moment, to just be there and see what happens and go with it. And that's very, very hard. And is very different than the language that I learned when I was studying to be an artist or when I was a curator, where there's this false presumption that you know what the hell you're doing. And you're distanced from it. You're intellectually distanced from it. I think the hardest thing I have found, and I think the most liberating thing about being creative, is to not know and just be in that moment. Not expect the next moment or spend too much time on the past moment. Just be in this moment.
Are there shared points for you all in terms of your experience of making these movies? Did you, in listening to one another, are there points that seem resonant, that are familiar?
Definitely. I mean, footage and what to do with footage. I mean, we're all sharing that. I mean, you have, when you're capturing that footage or when you discover that footage, you're like, thank you, Jesus. And then you get it into an editing room and you have to actually shape it into a way of communicating to other people. And that is a scary and difficult and trying thing.
Well, let me layer something else onto this, which is there were 3 questions that I had for you in asking you to prepare this that seemed to go together for me, which have to do with what the process was of making this film outside of the creative piece of it. Because once, in fact, you start doing this, you're involved in a pretty expensive, what can be a pretty expensive and complicated and challenging endeavor. What were the processes that you went through to develop the films, and how in fact did that have an impact on who you thought was actually going to see the movie? Where did you think it was going to go, and what was the process of trying to get it there? Any one of you?
I mean, I think that is the most helpful thing I've learned is in thinking about how do you democratize knowledge, how do you make your work accessible, is to really work to understand your audience or who you'd like your audience to be. And I think, certainly academia, you are always trying to, or maybe other people would disagree with me, but I think that often you're trying to demonstrate how clever you can be and how many sort of backbends and downward dog moves you can do with your vocabulary, and to be impressive. And it's a completely different way of communicating than you would in a work of art that you're trying to bring to people who are on the ground working and dealing with these issues on a daily basis. And so I think needing to be mindful and specific about who your audience is has been the most helpful thing in this process of contouring footage and thinking about what needs to be in and what needs to be out and what needs to be prioritized. I think it's essential.
All three of us have films about social justice issues, and documentaries are often about social justice issues, and I wonder why that form is so much more effective in bringing those issues forward than other forms or media. But they do find their audience. They find the audience that we want for them, and whether or not that's just to affirm the work that audience is doing or to spark new action, maybe it depends on how broadly the thing gets seen. But I'm really fascinated by in Sundance, almost every documentary in competition this year was about some sort of making some sort of political statement and trying to galvanize an audience into action in some prescribed way. But I don't know why the doc is used for that, or whether or not it's always been used for that. Is it new?
Well, I think it's also, it might be, going back to the expense part, it may also have to do with funding. A lot of the funding that's available for documentary film requires you to have a sort of social justice bent. I think if you just wanted to do like a sort of a cute slice of life thing, it's the streams are not there. But I think it's also a legacy of third cinema. That was a whole movement that began in the late 60s and early 70s, and it created a lot of resources that are still around. And I think it has contoured our thinking about what nonfiction film should be, that's what it's really. I think that would be your first, certainly for me, my first exposure to documentary film was Eyes on the Prize, Paris is Burning, and Tongues Untied. Those were like these things that made a huge impression on me, and I just think that's what I think of when I think about documentary filmmaking.
Where do you see, Linda, your film has been around for almost a decade now. 8 years anyway. It's been kind of in the public domain. What's the life really been? Who's seeing the film? Did it get a theatrical release? If not, how is that? What's the life of Flag Wars? And David, what are you hoping for at this point? And Robin, it sounds like you're thinking about it in a different arena that I think talk a little bit about that. Linda, what's happening?
I think this question and the previous question are really, as I hear them, are really speak to the business of being a documentary filmmaker. And that hasn't really changed a lot.
How it intersects with what your goal is if you were
right. And I would just say that I think goals are not static; that they evolve. So in terms of the business of being an independent filmmaker in the United States, we all have or will go through the same interaction with the business aspects of it. And whether you do it today, whether you did it 30 years ago, whether you do it 20 years from now, the business is going to have a certain protocol that it wants you as a filmmaker or you as artists to adhere to. And initially, when you start the process of making a work of art, in this case a film, you're inspired from a very personal and conceptual and creative and imaginative energy. You're inspired from that, and then you're faced with the industry, and then you say, okay, I'm going to take this industry on. So we all go through that process, I think. What I find more interesting, though, is how we come out of that process. And what I mean by that is that ultimately, our connection to this baby that we're creating is much stronger than the protocols of business or the demands and needs of business. And for many of us, we will just get it done. So then getting it done then also falls within the kind of stereotype of the starving artist who has credit card debt, et cetera, to make the film, typically. Not for everybody, but most people. And at some point, that debt falls away. At some point, it really is about this baby you're creating. And in the case of Flag Wars, it really became what drove us to complete that film, regardless of all the hurdles and valleys and bumps and obstacles we faced, was our commitment to tell this story that we had made when we went into that community and introduced ourselves. We said we were going to do X, Y, and Z. We were going to try to tell a story about what was happening in this community without, as objectively as we could possibly do it. And that commitment overrode the debt and all that kind of stuff. To say, the impact of the film, and then I'll be quiet, it's really interesting to be this distant from it. I went back to that neighborhood in June, and when we first went there in 1999, so this is a 99.9% African American community that had been that for 50 years. When we started filming, there was one white household in the block. When I went back in June, there are 3 black households in the community. So did the film have impact on what happened? Fuck no. The neighborhood has been completely economically and racially transformed. And the black folks who lived in that neighborhood, if they didn't die because they were old and owned their houses, that got displaced by public policy that says the best thing we can do for urban neighborhoods is to stop putting money in them, let them be gentrified, and to ship their residents to the first donut rung of the suburbs. Ship them to what is now boarded up malls and let them walk asphalt. All right? So did the film have any impact on that, though it showed everywhere and was, oh my God, now we're sensitive, we won't do this anymore? Forget about it. The policies are the same, things are still going, which is why I am now trying to find a more direct way for art to impact that, to intersect it in a way that changes that narrative, because this narrative is boring.
David? Rob?
Can I just ask, were you disappointed?
Was I disappointed with the film? Yeah. I mean, I can't tell, people sobbed, people gave testimonies, people said, I will tear down my 6-foot privacy fence and reach across the yard to the 80-year-old woman who lives next door. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised. Again, I felt like, at what point do we learn? Why are we continuing to just do the same thing over and over and over and over again? And I did. I was naive enough to think this film was so poignant and told in such a way that people represented themselves so that they could see their own contradictions on both sides, if you want to make it binary, but that we could all see our contradictions and also see our potential. That, something would change. So, I'm disappointed.
David and Robin, I'm going to ask you to respond to this, but I'm also going to open this up to all of you, since, in fact, I'm looking at the time, and I want you to have time to talk with Linda and David and Robin. David?
Well, my goal, because I'm telling a story that took place so long ago, and had a beginning, middle, and an end. I guess I don't expect. I haven't brought with it that expectation that I could stop something in its tracks. So I guess the expectation that I had is that beside historicizing this moment and placing AIDS activism alongside other global civil rights movements, and their accomplishments are so huge, and to explain those. But that it was to say that while it is now medically possible to survive AIDS, and the scientific problem was worked through. What we haven't worked through yet is the political problem, the economic problem, the social problem that is keeping these pills from people who need them. It's possible to survive this plague, but 35 million people with HIV today will never have access to these pills, and they will die in 18 months from their infection, the way New Yorkers used to die before the pills arrived here. So I want to see if I can maybe put that issue up in the air and suggest that it's something that we all have to work on in some way. There's no organization really that's trying to do that. It's such a large issue that it really needs a kind of a grassroots engagement, and maybe with luck people will begin doing that. And I just to add about distribution, I was lucky enough to get IFC to agree to distribute the film, so maybe we'll find the audience that'll get hooked on this message and do something with it.
I've been involved in watching this film develop for months now. And one of the things that we were able to do here that was actually really surprising and startling was bring the film in its developing stages to a student audience here at the New School. And because at some point when a number of fairly well-known filmmakers, all of whom still thought they were relatively young, vital, actually were sitting in a room watching this film and talking about what it was really like, it occurred to me that the people that I'm teaching were 3 or 4 years old when the cocktail arrived, and that it was likely that most of them did not know this story. And it's amazing how, in fact, there is a belief that we all know everything because of, in part because of the technology that's there and how accessible it seems to be, but we don't in terms of not very, history from not very long ago. In fact, with Linda, in watching your movie, it struck me that it was a decade ago, and that there has been enough time to totally affect the change that was that was beginning at that point. Robin?
Well, I also just think it's exciting to think about articulating How to Survive a Plague as a healthcare movie, because I think that is something that in thinking about, I've been thinking a lot about the intersection between identity and class, race and class in particular, and I think a lot of times social justice movements that start in certain communities that really are about access to resources, they in our historical memory, they are diverted into something else, and the ACT UP has become, a gay organization when ultimately it was a healthcare rights organization. And so I think that that's an exciting way to think about cross-cutting issues and how different communities that are marginalized from resources can think about building coalitions. And it's exciting. And the same with Flag Wars. It was so exciting to see this conversation about these, like you're saying, two marginalized communities and, battling over class, and what does that battling over class as it manifests in space. I mean, I think for me, I am taking a sort of wait and see attitude about distribution. My goal now is to make is to use as many of the resources as I can acquire to make a film that truly fulfills our intention, and then start from there and see how far we get from that. And I think when you're making films about members of historically marginalized communities, when you're making social justice films, it's easy to be very cynical from the outset that there's going to be all kinds of pressures to turn it into something else, you know, to turn this into a movie about how the one white person in our group, you know, took us to Cuba to learn salsa and we all lived happily ever after, or, you know, something of that nature. And so, you know, because I think that there's, you know, I mean, I would never expect something like the Black Power mixtape to have the reach and the audience that it did, and it was sold out at IFC for weeks. And there's not even really a story. It's just basically a meditation. And it's beautiful, and I thought really well done. So I think that the key is to kind of, to do whatever you can to get the resources you can to make what you want to make, knowing who your audience is and what your intentions are, and then just seeing where that takes you. But I think now there's no need to feel dependent on larger institutions to get your film out there, because there's so many ways to distribute directly to your audience, and so many inexpensive ways and accessible ways to distribute directly to your audience. You can have web-based streaming, you know, on a service that's $99 a month. I mean, that's, you know, you don't need, it's great to be in theaters if you can, but you don't need to get your message out there. So.
Yeah.
I was very moved by the ash scene at the gates, almost like the gates of hell. It was very powerful. Really, Linda, I loved your opening. Just very, you just floated along in that surreal spot. The question I have is that your films are all linear films in many ways. And we have a lot of different options, and I've been exploring non-linear, non-films, which are, I think of myself more as a moving, still audio image maker, and not having to answer to the gatekeepers. I'm just wondering, especially you, Linda, what your thoughts are going forward. How do you see yourself, with your passion, taking that into the future?
I mean, since 2004, I'm very, very much interested in a narrative structure that's based on a quilt, as opposed to a straight line. And where it's taking me now is, I mean, I may not quote you right, but I like the idea of like a non-filmmaker, image maker. But anyway, is saying, okay, if you can, I think stories that are structured on quilts have the capacity to provide the context that's necessary for people to be able to see themselves in multiple dimensions, that we are not either or, we are both and. And so I'm looking at this Project Eats is about what if the patch, in fact, is a community farm? What if the patch, in fact, is an audio installation? What if the patch is, and that all these patches in aggregate create this quilt that's a contextual story about a place in time.
Scott.
Prior to coming to this, I've been struggling over the past few months about what makes documentary filmmaking a social innovation, what makes it an innovation. And I'm still watching this hasn't particularly helped, but I think it's made it more interesting. And so one of the things I'm struggling with is that during even the panel discussion, we've heard film discussed as an artifact, as an art form perhaps. There's obviously been discussion about message, and it's very interesting that I'm beginning to piece together maybe what hopefully will be an answer to my question. I'm hoping you can help. If you look at film as it's a if you look at the art as an independent filmmaker, you're doing something that is definitively not intended for all the masses, or perhaps you are, and you're doing it in a particular way. And then you have an art form, which is something that's individually unique to your own interests, and even in terms of how you're creating the form is intrinsic to your own value system, maybe not intended for the masses. So, as a social innovation, though, if an innovation is something that's perceived as new by members of a social system, it's intended to be adopted by lots of people. And I'm very interested in the idea of an unsuccessful innovation is just as valuable as successful innovation. How does this idea play within your own work? How do you rationalize the idea of the film being an art form and the film being a message and the film being your own and yet having to be something that carries the weight of the message to be adopted by many?
Well, I guess for me, I don't see to say that the film is a creative work is not to say that it has only my unique individual stamp on it. And actually, in the tradition of third cinema, one of the principles is that actually, something that's sort of more like second cinema, like your Woody Allen, Spike Lee, like I'm so special and intellectual, and and this is my unique and really exciting, sexy, like good art point of view, right? Which is great. But there are styles of filmmaking that are very much not meant to reflect a unique point of view, but meant to reflect a community's point of view about a certain issue or a certain conflict or a certain history. And so, when I say that I'm a Black Studies filmmaker, I feel very much bound by the tradition of struggle against racism. And when I make choices in my filmmaking, I really try to be as accurate and clear, which is not always pretty, right? It's not to say, it's always a fluff piece, it's always, flattering, but I do feel that I am working in service of that tradition and that this work is something that should contribute to it in a substantial way. It's not just about me and my taste and my interest. And so I think in that way, documentary film that's infused with that intention is a social innovation. I think that it's fair to say that in of itself, it doesn't necessarily need to be, but when it's infused with this concern, then it becomes one.
The question you're asking is something I've been struggling with since 2004, and my reason for that struggle was that I didn't mention that in 2004, right after we finished Flag Wars, I decided I wanted to do a documentary on the electoral process during the 2004 election, and have since documented. I also shot the 2008 election. And we'll do something in terms of footage with 2012. In the process of doing that, in the process of being with a very, it was great. There was 3 of us. We're all running and gunning with cameras, and we're in the nose hairs of every candidate. We had access like you could not believe, even to Al Sharpton, which was not easy to get access to Al Sharpton. And to shoot Verite, not easy at all. And after 10 weeks of really having that kind of access and just running and gunning and running and gunning and running and gunning, I stopped. I said, stop, return off the cameras, I'm going back to New York. And the reason was that in that process, I became more and more aware of several things. One, how, and this isn't profound, but the extent to which we as the public, we as the citizenry, have absolutely no say in the political operation of this country. We really are, we're props. And that became more and more, the theater of politics is so tight that it became really, I said, oh damn, all of us are just props in this sucker. That was one thing. The other thing that hit me was I personally didn't know how I could tell that story in a way that that debunked that made people aware of, we are all props in this theater, right? Because media has its own power. Media has its own power, and that as filmmakers, and especially documentary filmmakers, we are too often sucked in and don't even know it, that the very thing that we are trying to undermine, we actually elevate. Mm-hmm. You know, like you brought up mixtape Black Power. That film bothered me tremendously. And it bothered me tremendously because that film does not exist as footage on tape or archival footage. It exists as an example of how nothing has changed. That Black filmmakers could not have made that film back when Stokely, I knew him when he was Stokely, when that was happening, and they could not make it now. I went to a screening at MoMA to see that film.
I was there.
And were you there? And do you remember a young Black woman who stood up and said, I would like to have access to some of this footage? And the filmmaker says, not possible. Wow. He said, not possible. And I was livid that the moderator didn't say, oh, this is a teaching moment, let's deal with that. Let's deal with the fact that it is not possible for this Black woman who wants to tell a story about this subject, she can't get this footage. David just said that there are people throughout this world who have no more access to this medicine than the activists in your film had. Nothing has changed, and yet we, as filmmakers, feel like, I don't know, it bothers the shit out of me that we ultimately produce films that actually reflect the image that the audience wants to see of themselves. I don't want to do that. I think we need to look at our real image, and that's hard.
What is that going to look like?
It won't be either or. It'll be both and. That we are victim and victimizers, all of us, no matter what our status, no matter what our race, no matter what our gender. And that until we get to that, I don't see how we change anything.
David?
I liked Black Power mixtape. Sorry.
No, but I mean, I think that, I mean, just not to interrupt, but I think that is, I think, in thinking about how things are made, right? I mean, I did not know that now all of the footage would be privatized, and you know, in contrast to Women Art Revolution, where actually all the footage is at Stanford online, and anybody can go and look through it and use it as a resource. I mean, I think that is fair to put that in the consideration of how you feel about the movie, and I think that's tough.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not just, I mean, back in the day when that footage was being shot, it would not have been possible. Those same people would not have let Black folks shoot them.
They were all Swedes, right?
It was Swedes, and it's owned by the Swedish television station, and so, it's not public domain.
Yeah, do you all know this film? It's really fascinating. They found a stack of canisters of film in the basement of some television station in Sweden, and it was like this series of lengthy interviews with, you know, kind of Black Power movement figureheads. And they edited the film into this kind of interesting, just, you were right to call it dreamy, I think. These meditations on how people who we felt we recognized or knew from the media, from local media, how they were perceived elsewhere. And I thought that was really instructive, that their perception was so different. The perception was so much more encouraging and open-armed, and allowed for character to show, I think, in the footage in a way that the way that footage of that movement was gathered here didn't allow for personality and character. It was all about political message. And that's what, for me, that's what struck me as being interesting, just how the rest of the world might have chronicled the same story that we thought we'd already seen.
But I think if you're born, if you don't have the recollection of how people were perceived in the time, you might think that how the Swedes, where people had to run, Sweden, where people had to go and people still live, that were in the Black Panther Party, that's how it was in America too, that everybody felt this way about Angela Davis, or that other part is not as clear in the film. And I think that is, I mean, especially, teaching and working with youth, it is interesting to see how they take those things without the historical context.
Right.
And yeah, so I think it's difficult.
But on this question of social innovation, I don't think I have anything to add for you, except that why is your question just about documentary films? Isn't it about like all nonfiction gathering and all nonfiction presentation? And certainly the idea of innovation in nonfiction book writing is, I think would probably follow the same challenge.
If you were authors, I would ask the same question.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One last comment that I have, having known David and Linda as they were working on this film, and after, well, actually, David, yours is so new, but with Linda in the years that have followed, I have learned so many stories about the film that never made it into the film, that actually were, that subverted the telling of the story. David, you're talking about actually how what you sacrificed, because it just wouldn't fit into the story that you needed to tell or you wanted to tell. Again, it raises all sorts of questions about what, in fact, the act of telling these stories and making, what it is what gives you the vision to actually shape the story for so many, which is it's an interesting challenge to me.
Well, it's not just vision, but courage, really, because it's courage to make decisions that you don't want to have to make, and to recognize that the audience that you're reaching for has limitations in their ability to concentrate, in their ability to remember story points, to absorb political messages, to sit in one place for a period of time. And then, so it's really a matter of deletion to get to the place where we've presented what we recognize as a documentary film, or a book, or a magazine article, or a play, and all of these things are, say that they represent themselves as truth, but really they're only a path toward truth, as defined by the person who is making those decisions.
Yes.
A piece of useful information that other documentary filmmakers might like. You brought up the Swedish film. A lot of the agencies, the PR agencies, go to the French and the Europeans to find out about what's happening in America, because they study America better than we do. So you might be able to find footage of things that you're interested in French or Italian or English or Swedish film.
Mm-hmm.
Segments that are probably a lot less costly than going through other sources. So just a piece of useful information.
Yes.
I was just curious what suggestions you had as to where you found your archival films. Well, every one of your pieces seems to incorporate that somehow. I was just curious as to how do you find it? How do you go about it?
I'll jump in quick. Sometimes by going to foreign television stations, where you might find things that are kept that aren't kept here. But I started my archival research at the New York Public Library, where in their manuscripts division, they have actually saved a large quantity of AIDS activist documentation, including video and film footage, and then used that trove to identify other shooters just by watching the film,
and see who else was shooting, and then find them, and then look at their library, and then find other people and look at their library. So it was really kind of an investigative undertaking. For me, although in a defined world, what made it complicated was that a lot of those shooters had died of AIDS, and then it became a challenge to find where there's, who held their estate. Was it a lover at the time? Was it a family member? Did they save these things? And even if they did save them, would they be willing to open those boxes again and let me dig in through them?
We only used just that opening sequence archival for that, and what we did was just ask people who lived in the neighborhood if they had home movies.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just wonder, documentary film has the illusion of being, you use the word truth, some version of someone's truth. I wonder how much you struggle with the power that you hold in shaping a story and excluding some voices while choosing to include them and include others. And, with the goal of democratizing the process, you're actually forced to exclude certain voices of the truth. So does that ever paralyze you, or does it, how do you reconcile yourself with the guilt or the knowledge that you're actually shutting some truths down by the virtue of making your story?
Tony alluded to actually, he alluded to what you're just asking in Flag Wars, and there was a lot of footage that if we had incorporated in this documentary would have made this documentary one-sided. And so we had made a decision to try to present the characters in our story in a way that would allow people to engage what they connected to with this character as well as what they connected it to this character over here. So that really is what guided what fell on the floor and what got on the screen.
I mean, I think it's, you do the best that you can with the situation. But I mean, it is, I think before I started filmmaking, when you would see celebrities talk about how, it wasn't them with the 13-year-old girl, or, things have been edited, you're just like, how much, can you really do with editing? And it's actually astonishing how much you can really do with special effects and editing. It's really astonishing how manipulative you can be if you have the time and the resources. But I think that that's when the ethics come in, and especially if your goal is to, I think also people, as believable as something can look, I think people have generally good instincts, and you can sort of manipulate yourself into a corner where if something comes across is not quite right, it will undermine what you're trying to accomplish if your goal is to make something for social justice aims. So I think, it's really in your best interest to be as fair as possible, and I think that people can tell when you've done a sincere job versus when you really have done something that's meant to, that's gone too far in the way of manipulation and propaganda.
Yeah, but everybody has a point of view.
That's true. It's true.
You can't escape that.
I just told myself what turned out to be a lie, which is that I'll put it in the DVD extras. I thought I could catch-all for everything. I thought I could do that, but they say 10 minutes max. I thought I was just going to pack everything there.
The website.
I guess.
Yeah. The new DVD extras.
We all tell ourselves a lot of lies. to get to the truth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Quick question for you, Linda, in your film. I really found it fascinating that conflict between the two marginalized groups. Was that something you knew going into it, or that just happened in front of you?
Yeah. Like I said, Laura and I approached the film assuming that there wouldn't be the tension that actually we discovered and followed. Yeah.
Now, the story could, it's a common theme in many American cities. What was it about Columbus, Ohio that brought you there?
We actually looked at Chicago. We looked at Atlanta. It was happening all over the country. And we looked there was a third city, or fourth, there were 4 cities. And ultimately, I'm from Columbus, but that was the reason not to do it in Columbus. I actually didn't want to go back and shoot in Columbus. But we decided to do it there, quite frankly, because we figured most of the world wouldn't think there were gays in Columbus, Ohio. Like the idea of introducing to the world that gays lived in Columbus, Ohio was something that we said, oh, that puts a twist to the story. Yeah.
But you also had a device that led to the name.
Oh, yes. I mean, the whole reason this came about, frankly, because I was writing a script for a fiction film, and I went back home, and my father picked me up from the airport, and as we're driving and turning onto our block, there are these rainbow flags, and I know what a rainbow flag is, but not in my neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. So what I thought was so insane. So I say to my dad, as he's parking the car, I'm going, so is there a resurgence of the flower clubs? Like when I was growing up, like my grandmother and my aunts and stuff, they had little flags for their flower clubs. And he goes, what are you talking about? I said, these flags. And he goes, oh no, that's what the gay guys put up when they move in. And I went, what? Oh, yeah, I know that flag, but are you serious? And so when I came back to New York, I was mentioning it to Laura, and she goes, that would make a good documentary. So then I said, we're not going to Columbus, and we started researching other cities. But anyway. Yeah, so the title of the film came from that. Because what would happen is that the gay homeowners that would move in, or the gays that were moving in, would put up a flag, and then the black folks in the neighborhood would put up a flag, and then this flag got bigger, and then this flag. It was unbelievable. At the end of us being there, they had flags that were like stadium-sized flags flying off their porches. It was bizarre. So, yeah.
I'm looking at the time. I think we need to wrap up. Is there a burning question in the audience? Yes.
I actually went to Columbus, Ohio after the 90s when it was quite bad, and also went to Detroit for quite a while. And Detroit is huge on urban gardens.
I know.
I have so much love for Detroit and its revival, but I also fear it's going to undergo the same kind of gentrification that New York has. And it seems like at a recent move, I just recently transplanted to New York, and no one seems to care about it here. No one cares about the gentrification that's going on here. Everyone just turns a blind eye to it and moves into their new homes in Brooklyn. It doesn't care about why it's built like a railroad. And I don't understand why there's no uprising about it.
There is. I mean, I live in Brooklyn.
I just moved here, so I'm just not seeing it really,
Well, I would say, I mean, this around the new school is not gentrification. This has been going on for, I mean, it's a result, but I think that there are these battlegrounds in the South Bronx, in Crown Heights, in Bed-Stuy, further out in the city where people are organizing and are very much concerned, Bushwick, where people are there, and these are communities that are actually at the end, at the end of the line of a wave of gentrification that has been coming through these boroughs. I mean, South Bronx is sort of the end of the line of the wave of gentrification. It's gone up from 96th Street. In Crown Heights, it's the wave of gentrification. It's gone down Eastern Parkway. And so, I mean, if you are interested, there are organizations that are mobilizing and working to stop the wave.
To me, I just prefer a neighborhood like that. I like the space, the price, plus there's actual character. And the same thing with Detroit. I was downtown Detroit, but I don't know. I read a lot about it, and I see it in communities like Williamsburg and stuff, but it doesn't seem like it really affects people as far as.
I think it affects people who are from there. I mean, I think Williamsburg. I mean, some of those communities that you're mentioning, the gentrification's over. Yeah. The people who live there who did fight in the 90s for Williamsburg lost. They got put out of their lofts, they got put out of their homes. But there are still these battlegrounds where people very much are still contesting, and they still live there.
Can I say something about that? Just yesterday, at the Community Church of New York on
Other comments? Yes?
Nice question. I also a fellow grad student from Australia.
Hey, how you doing?
Limited studies, and one of the first things I learned was the political is or the personal is political. But when I started to really branch off to the activist kind of person, I kind of took it as the personal was political kind of thing. So I wanted to know what point in your life that it kind of changed instead of just doing this, you know, because you loved it, to doing it because if I don't do it, then why? I never know about it kind of thing in your filmmaking.
Yeah, you know, I think it's what has always motivated me in life, always, and it's taken me to live a lot of decades to realize that this is the one constant, has been that, and it sometimes makes me weepy, so forgive me if I get a little weepy, but is that I grew up in a neighborhood, in a community where I saw beautiful people who were very strong and amazing, and they didn't know it, or they didn't believe it. They thought they weren't beautiful. They thought they weren't strong, and they thought that other people determined who they were. And all my life, I have been fighting against that, and it has taken different shapes and forms, but I'm just trying to say to my folk, you're the most amazing, beautiful people. That's not to say other people aren't, but it's just that in terms of my heart, it's really important that we see that.
One last.
Thank you really quickly for all your dedication and your work in exposing these issues to the public. Even if you may feel like you didn't get an immediate response or it didn't stop what happened in Columbus, if one person is enlightened or one person is moved, then you can stop.
Thank you. Thank you.
One last.
I'd like to leave you with this to think about. It was in a documentary on Robert Capa where Henri Cartier comes on and he says, this taught me what I do. I thought I was a filmmaker or a painter or whatever I was. And he says, taking photographs is like making love. You have to love, and I add, you have to love the people you're photographing.
Yeah.
And that's what you do. And that's what you can see in the films.
Yeah, it's true.
Is that love. And I think that's really what we put in is what we get out, is that love that we share and that we hope that maybe touches somebody else.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you
you all.
very
Thank you so
much.
much for organizing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So when is it coming out in